Hello. How's it going, y'all? You good? Yay! Cool. So I'm super excited to talk about this. I talk about various things, game development, design, user experience, programming. But I'm also a time management nerd. So I don't know if any of you are like super into like calendaring and like to-do lists, but that's like my life. So every time that I'm working on a new project, I am trying to be efficient and improve upon my work every single time. So obviously, I don't always succeed at improving because I'm a human being and failure is inevitable, but I certainly learn different things along the way. And today I'd like to share some of those things. But before we jump in, a little bit about myself. Firstly, I'm a product designer at Etsy, which is a website that lets people buy and sell unique goods from around the world. And I mostly focus on the payments experience within Etsy. So that's things like helping people to understand their bill and updating their payment preferences and all kinds of fun things. Money's great. So I'm also the co-founder of Brooklyn Gamery, which is a studio that makes endearing and weird video games. So we made a game called Breakup Squad, for example, where you basically avoid your ex at a party, fun stuff. We also organize diversity-focused events. So we have one coming up in June called the Game Devs of Color Expo. And that highlights game developers of color. I also make lots of other weird random things. For example, websites, zines. I made a couple of zines. They're on Etsy, a surprise. I make lots of video games by myself and with friends. So I'm doing all kinds of things. And because of that, I'm learning a lot about how to improve the way that I'm working. So the goal of today's talk is going to be to help you worry less about the how and more about all the other stuff that's involved when you're creating things, right? The who, the what, the when, the where, and the why. So the how is the processes and the tools that we're using. And the W's that I mentioned are basically the core purpose of the project that you're working on. So the goal of this is to help you save time by doing things in hopefully an order that is more constructive, that leads to you getting lost a little bit less and leads to more focus. We're going to do that by talking about a couple of topics. Firstly, why and when processes and tools can be helpful and thinking about them, and why they can be unhelpful and when, and ways to focus less on the processes and stuff like that, and more on what you're trying to do. So as I mentioned, we're going to start with the positives, because happiness is great, and compliment sandwiches are awesome. So processes and tools can be helpful, right? Like, they're awesome. They give us this sense of guidance. They help us to center our energy around something that works. Sometimes people are, for example, unsure of how to do things, and processes and tools, these things that were already created, can really help us to pull in the right people to help get things done at a reasonable time frame. So for example, when I was a newer designer, I'd read a book called The UX Team of One. I don't know if any of you in here have seen it, but it's an absolutely great book. It's full of these different tools that you can use during different parts of the user experience design process. And it really helped me to figure out, especially as a newer designer, what to do next when I was starting to feel stuck. So it included things like what to do when you want to research something, what to do when you want to design, when you're in the design process, how to pull people in, how to do different forms of testing. So it was very, very useful as a new designer to have this framework of things that I could reference. Additionally, when effective, it helps us to get things done quicker. So for example, the agile movement or methodology, whatever you want to call it, magic, it has great ideas. So for example, pair programming helps us to share knowledge across teams. Early and continuous delivery ensures that products are tested in the real world so that you're not launching a piece of hot garbage. When it comes to tools, you've got Sketch, for example, and Sketch helps me to design much quicker than I used to be able to design. It's got these amazing exporting tools. It is made for digital production, and most design teams that I've worked with have actually switched from other things to Sketch once they realized how much faster it was for them. So again, it's really efficient, and it also keeps you from reinventing the wheel because someone else already did the hard work. They also help us to improve at our craft, especially if the people who are creating these things are actually sharing the learnings that they've found out. So they experimented a lot, they found out what worked, what didn't work, and then they wrote something about it in a lot of these cases. And that helps us because then we can avoid making the same mistakes that they had to get to that point. The following are some use cases when thinking about these things can be helpful. Firstly, if you're feeling like you're lacking clarity, so if you're confused about who should be doing what, if roles are unclear, that's a case in which some structure can be really useful. For example, I've had situations where I wasn't really sure what the team I was working on was building. For example, I was working on a game for several years. It never actually happened, yay. But we kept changing the goal of the project and the scale and the scope of the project, and everything was very unclear. There were many times where I didn't know what I was working on versus other people, and we probably could have used some agile thinking for that project. So from that point on, whenever I worked with people from that team, that's kind of the mindset that I went in to the projects with. Additionally, if you're feeling frustrated, Process can give you a framework to identify why you're feeling frustrated and what's not working. It can also help you figure out ways to actually resolve those issues. So for example, I was working on a project where I felt super frustrated. It was with a new product team. And I sat down and I realized it was because I needed more structure. So I started asking to include more things like team retrospectives and more concrete timelines. And I wanted to be involved in like all the stand-ups and stuff. So that was super awesome and helpful for me. And Process, again, was really helpful in that case. The third case is if you're feeling like you're being kept out of the loop, which is super common, especially in newer teams or larger companies. So if you don't know what others are working on, if you or someone else doesn't know why they're implementing a feature, that's a void that needs to be filled by some kind of structure. So processes and tools, these things, structure can be really awesome, but it really, again, depends on when you're bringing it in. So we've talked about all the happiness and the joy. We're going to get really sad now. Sorry. So we're going to go back in time for a little bit of a story because failure, as I said, is inevitable. So I'm going to talk about a time that I spectacularly failed because of the obsession that I mentioned with process. So a long time ago, when I was a baby designer, I just got out of college. I'd found my way into a product design job, and I was Super Junior. That is a great band, by the way. Super Junior is good. K-pop fans, yay. So I didn't know a lot about user research and different product design methodologies. So my boss sent me to conferences and also gave me access to a lot of different reading resources, like books and articles. And I was learning about what was good versus bad. I was working at this company that was very waterfall, and what that means is that one group of people, so for example, product designers will pass things to the next group of people, kind of work in succession, which looks really cool if you're into Gantt charts, but isn't the most productive sometimes. So it wasn't working for us, and it wasn't really considered a good process for people, mostly because the designers on the team were given these requirements, and then the mock-ups would be sent to developers once they were done. And then the products would then be launched, and we wouldn't have time to look at them. So it was kind of a classic issue. I don't know, has this happened to any of y'all in the audience? Humans? Yeah, yay, sadness, woo. So you know what this is like. It's not fun. So this really piqued my interest because I was getting pissed off every time this happened. And I was just like, what is a better way of doing this? There's got to be a better way out there. I'm like reading all this stuff. I'm getting super inspired. So I was looking at things like Lean UX, where everyone was like super happy, and it was like amazingly collaboration focused. And the whole point of it was to get feedback in order to make these quicker decisions. And of course, magical sticky notes, they were everywhere. So I tried to start implementing these processes and techniques into my current job. At the same time, the development team was also trying to figure out, like, what are we doing, because it's not working. So we're both trying to like fix things from different angles. First problem, yay. But they were also trying to figure out if they could implement the agile methodologies or movement thought processes into their work. So Agile is an alternative to traditional project management, if you're wondering, and it focuses on iteration and quick feedback. So they were implementing things like stand-ups, they were doing scrums, sprint planning, that is a really hard phrase for me to say, and sprint reviews. And so there were lots of meetings all the time, there were also retrospectives, and the goal was to be this like happy circle of constant delivery and production. I think we all thought in this case that these methodologies and these mindsets were one-size-fits-all kinds of things, that no matter what size company we were working with, they would be able to just be applied and automatically successfully work. Surprise! Didn't work, yay! So they just didn't fit within the architecture and the context of our company. So our company was like 40 years old, possibly even older. The teams were just siloed, they were in different locations, we never talked to each other, there were different working hours. It was very hard for us to communicate, which meant that any new process that we tried to implement was just not gonna stick. We weren't thinking about anything involved, like our context or anything, we were just thinking like, we've gotta improve this process, we've gotta make it better. And that's not possible within that context or that case. It was a complete recipe for disaster, basically. So from this entire experience, I realized that you just can't use a process and expect it to work every single time. You just can't use a new tool and expect it to work automatically because it worked for other people. It was really distracting, basically. And I want to dissect this a little bit. I kind of mentioned some bits throughout, but I really want to talk about why I failed and other cases when I've seen people fail as well. Other cases in which it can be harmful, and then I want to talk about, as I said before, how we can do this a little bit better. Firstly, right versus wrong. I really got caught up in this idea that there was a good, there was a bad, there was this idea of truly agile, there's like the best programming language, there's the best product. Everyone's got like an opinion on which thing is the best, right? So that's issue number one. There's also this sense of hierarchy. So for example, within programming languages, everyone's got a preference. The one on the slide isn't mine. I just put them in some random order. Don't be offended. I'm sorry. So everyone's got like this language that they think is the best, and it's totally against the point, right? Even more fun, within the hierarchy, there is more hierarchy. Sorry again if you really like Backbone. But you know, everyone's got like their ideal framework that they're working with, and sometimes picking one of those can be harder work than actually defining the scope of your project and actually getting the work done. Additionally, if you're practicing processes by the books, that means that you can't be flexible, and that can cause a lot of unnecessary frustration because it doesn't allow for variables that come with things, like I mentioned before, pre-existing team structure, for example, the size of the company, and it really might not work with perhaps the people on the team and their preferred style of working. So those were the issues that were mainly cropped up in the story that I just told, but I also do want to talk about a couple of more issues that can be caused. So firstly, power structures, power shifts, and vacuums. So say that there's a person who decides that you've got to use like the best new framework, and they spend time and they implement it, but then they leave without telling anyone how to use it. This is a real life thing that has happened to me. It was not great. So when one person uses something or like pushes something on everyone else without sharing that knowledge, that understanding of how it works, why it's important, if they leave, then that's really bad, but also it just means that no one understands why it's important or how to use it, which is a failure because it's a lack of sharing knowledge. Tool-specific one, not built here. How many of y'all have heard this phrase before? Ooh, yes, okay. So, yes, not built here. So this is a case in which people will reject a tool if it wasn't built in-house. So people would rather waste time building things that already exist rather than just using something that's out there. And sometimes this has valid reasons. For example, security concerns, right? That's a real thing. But sometimes it's like real programmer cred, which is a whole other talk of rage. Lastly, a focus on constantly abiding by this perfect process, right? We just talked about this like idea that you can't be flexible. If you're not flexible, then you're going to constantly be thinking about how you could be better, about the time that you didn't do enough retrospectives, or you didn't do the backlog grooming perfectly, or you didn't do the perfect design process. Everyone needs time to actually think about what they did well. Because if you're being introspective all the time, I don't know if any of you have like social anxiety, but I'm like always in my head like, oh my God, I could have talked to someone in this way that was like much better. That's like this. That's like this. It's the same kind of anxiety that you're causing yourself if you're never actually stepping away and thinking about what you did well. So you need to make sure that you're spending time not just thinking about like how amazing this could have been if you had done a little bit better, but also like, yeah, I made something really cool. So not having time to celebrate can really be harmful. All right, so we've heard the good, we've heard the bad. I also want to talk about ways to take your mind off of being this perfect, amazing being. How to refocus. All right, firstly, breathe. We're all here, we're seeing amazing talks, we're seeing amazing things that make us want to like be better designers, better builders, better creators. Just remember what it's all about, right? We just heard a talk that was all about creativity, about making things. We saw like amazing stuff that you can do with CSS grids. We've seen all these amazing things that people are doing. The whole point of what we're doing and what we're working on is to create stuff and hopefully put it out into the world at some point. Maybe it's like a week, maybe it's like a year. At some point, you hope that it gets out, right? So it's really about the stuff that we're making, and we're working on cool things. So like, please don't forget that. Just breathe. Secondly, change the conversation. So I don't know if any of y'all have ever had this conversation happen, but I've been at the start of so many projects where people are just like, all right, we're going to use React for this project. And I'm just like, but wait, like, what are we doing? What is our entire goal of our project? What? So if you're starting a new project, make sure that you're clearly defining what you're making and why you're making it. Who is it for? Like, ask those basic questions because that's like the whole point of the project. If you're working on something already, but you feel like you're getting caught up and you don't really know what you're working on, as we said earlier, just step back, ask the same questions, think about the core objectives and the intended outcome. And this is going to help you to ensure that you're not getting involved in like unnecessary discussions and like thinking about all these tools and stuff like that before you've actually figured out what you're making. If you couldn't tell where this was going, surprise! Make your own process, yay! Every time you work on something with a new set of people, you're gonna have to figure out how they all work, right? Like every single human being on this planet that you're ever gonna possibly get to work with has a different way of working. So there is no way that everyone's gonna be able to work the same way. Just because you, for example, are able to work in this masterful way and you've got your own process, even your own process is gonna change when you're working with other people. So I found it really useful to try a test run without getting too process heavy, see how things work, and then if you find that things are getting a little bit out of hand, that's when it's useful to start bringing in these outside methodologies and these tools. So look for what works with teams that are similar to your size, for example, at companies that are similar to your scale. Take out the parts of their processes that are working for you, use those things. If there are things that aren't working, then maybe don't try to use, or just don't use those things. I mean, it also doesn't have to be, for example, an actual hard requirement. All of these things are very flexible. Just remember to be flexible. As I said, consider your context. So there's things like company size, team composition, scale of your project, how the people on your team work best, for example. Hard deadlines, if there are any, things like hard requirements that are set by an outside force. These are all things that are going to affect the project that you're working on, the specific process that you're using in that case. All of these things change, and even the set of people that you're working with. If something worked well during one project, it doesn't mean it'll work the same way during another for the reasons that I just mentioned. If you don't have an outside deadline that's being imposed, it's always very helpful to create your own. So I found this super useful to just say, pie in the sky, when would we finish this project? And then work backward from there to figure out, okay, if we know that we want to finish by, say, September, then that means that we need maybe probably this much time to do these things. And that helps us to create a little bit more structure so that once we've already identified what we're working on, we have a deadline, we can kind of move forward from there. The other nice thing is if you're like me and you're a calendar nerd, this means that you can start actually putting dates on the calendar, you can have really cool milestones, you can set up your awesome meetings. Things will probably start to feel a little bit less floaty. I'm like in love with direction that is caused by these deadlines and these dates. So I very much suggest creating these deadlines. And then the other thing to note here is once you've got these deadlines, you're also going to want to create a single source of truth. So what that means is one place where people actually can go to reference these things. Otherwise, people are going to get a little bit confused if there's like emails and there's other places that they can also reference these deadlines, these objectives. All of these things should hopefully be written down in a singular place that can be referenced very easily. So once you've got the who, you've got the what, the when, where, and the why, then you can start thinking, okay, we've got our deadlines, we know who's on it, we know the team, we know when we want to do this, all this stuff is already figured out, and hopefully the platforms, you've defined all these things. That's when you want to say, okay, now that we know what we're trying to create, how are we going to do it? So going in this order will hopefully lead to you spending more time thinking about the people who are actually using your product or your project or whoever it is, whatever it is, maybe it's puppies. And then you'll be able to say, okay, now that I know exactly what we're making, let's figure out what platform, for example, to use or what framework to use in this case. The following things are some things to remember when you're thinking about the how portion, that little tiny box up there. Firstly, make sure that you communicate up front. So ask people how they like to work when you start getting into this thinking about processes, because some people, as I mentioned before, have preferred ways of working, and the more experienced you get, the more you're going to understand what you like and what you dislike. So if you can talk about that up front, then that saves you a lot of time in the long run as well. So always ask people if they've got preferences that they have personally. Again, if you couldn't tell, trendy hotness is cool for like 5 minutes. I don't know if any of y'all have adopted any of the Angular things or remember the debacles that would happen when you tried to upgrade every single time there was a new version of Angular out, but I remember, and I'm sad. So just because something seems like it's cool, maybe that's not the greatest reason to use it. Maybe the better reason is because you're making something that requires that tool. So what I'm trying to say is use something that works for you. Use something that works for what you're trying to make. Next, you want to make sure that you share knowledge. So I mentioned earlier what happens if you don't. So if you're deciding to make a project with a new tool, make sure that you are sharing that information with other people. If you're working on a new project in general, make sure that you're sharing as much information with people as possible. Ask people if they have questions. People who are curious and have questions, please ask those. That'll save you a lot of time as well. If you're an engineer, please work with other engineers and encourage them to pair with each other, because you don't know when someone different will have to work on a project. You don't know when you'll need to go on vacation, or maybe you'll get sick. You just never know what'll happen. So it's really great to make sure that people are sharing that information, that everyone's aligned also. And also another example is if you're a designer, make sure that other people are included in the design process so that they feel involved and they can contribute to design decisions earlier. Being flexible is really important because, as I said, there's no perfect process that works every time. There's no perfect tool. Everything has its imperfections. We are all imperfect, ugly, disgusting human beings. So just make sure that you remember there's no right or wrong way to do something. There is only a way to do something. Maybe it's better, maybe it's worse, but it's never right or wrong. If something isn't agile, that's okay. If you're not using the newest, hottest thing that's out there, that's totally fine too, right? So as an example of like how it can be harmful to be a little bit more inflexible and why I would suggest you be flexible and remember the context that you're working within. There was a time that I was working with a design team and we wanted to launch this like super quick test to a product. And we decided that we were going to do it without user testing because we were like, whatever, it's super fast. We just want to see what happens. And another designer that I was working with got really angry because we didn't user test. They were like, oh my God, how dare you not user test this feature? And we're like, dude, it's like a couple minutes change. We can roll it back in no time. We just want to see what happens. So just make sure that you're not causing yourself extra grief. Be flexible. Remember, there isn't always the same process. A process changes every time. A team changes every time. We're all human beings. Nextly, of course, remember to, pat yourself on the back because you're creating stuff. If it's getting out into the world, that is awesome. If you keep focusing on what you did not do well, as I said, you might burn out. So just make sure to take a moment, #self-care, just breathe, say nice a couple of times, be like, yeah, I did that well, you did that well, we're super amazing people, we made something. Because not everyone gets to do that, and we're all very special and sparkly and magical. So, to wrap up, in summary, processes and tools can be useful, but also detrimental. They've got good sides, they've got bad sides. Context also matters most, right? So different strokes, what might be right for you may not be right for some. Power shifts and vacuums can happen if only one person is pushing for a new process or a tool without sharing that knowledge. So just remember to think about whether it's you or someone else, what happens if they peace out for some reason? What happens if they go on vacation? Is the team or the group of people going to be able to work without them? In terms of advice, I always suggest considering your context first. So what is the scale of your team? What is the size of the project? Do you have a timeline in mind? What are your objectives? What are you trying to do? Who are you trying to reach? What are you trying to accomplish? This is going to help you figure out what is necessary to actually accomplish your goal, right? Next, accept imperfection because, again, we're all ugly and gross. So nothing's ever going to be perfect. Accept it. Yay. Additionally, there's always going to be something new out there, so please try not to worry about the new hotness. Again, consider your context and how it's going to affect the project that you're working on and what you're trying to do. And lastly, make sure that you're sharing what you learn. For example, I'm on a stage right now. Maybe one of y'all or many of y'all will be on stage next time. I'm sharing things that I've learned from past things. I try to make sure that I'm sharing information with my team, and I ask a lot of questions and encourage people on the teams that I work with to do the same. So just make sure that you're sharing. And finally, make sure that you celebrate what you make. Make sure that you make. Always be celebrating. You are very cool people, I'm very sure. Hopefully I see some of you later. Your team is great, you are great, you have unique skills, you're making really cool things, and I hope that you will never forget that you're a magical human being who gets to do awesome stuff like be here. Thank you. Hearts.